Next we'll add some recessed areas like this path here and the mud for the puddle. So over the horizon layer, we will go ahead and add a new layer called path. We can turn preserve transparency off, and we want to make a selection of the horizon layer by right-clicking on it and doing select layer content, or you can use this shortcut button here. And we will hide the selection, or you can do show hide marquee. We'll move to the path layer, and now if we paint, it'll stay inside this selected area. We'll use the Scratchboard tool, and we'll select a dark brown color, something like this. And you want to make sure that your path is thinner in the background, and it gets thicker as it goes into the foreground and kind of more level. So I'm just kind of sketching it in like this, and then I'll use a bigger brush to fill in the middle. It's okay if it's a little wobbly because we're going to blend it a little bit. That looks good. And let's set the composite method to multiply. That way we can blend it without any issues here. Let's use the coarse oily blender first to blend it, and we want to blend just with vertical strokes up and down. And what that's going to do is that's going to make the edge look kind of jagged, like there's grass growing next to it and overlapping it. So I'm just going back and forth, up and down, up and down, up and down. You don't want it to get too jagged, and you want it to get less noticeably jagged as you move into the background. So right about here, I'll stop blending it that way, and I'll move down to the bottom side, going down and up and kind of changing it up here and there, like so. Because if this is taller grass, it would kind of be overlapping the view of the path. If you don't do this to the path, your path is going to look like it's on short grass, and that's not going to make any sense when we draw on the taller grass later. Let's also blend using the diffuse blur, and up here near the horizon we'll blend horizontally across with a couple light strokes. Then for the rest of it we will blend vertically, very lightly, just straight down, like so. That looks good. Let's turn on preserve transparency. And let's make this path lighter in the foreground. So I'm just going to select a lighter brown, and I'm going to paint with the airbrush just over the end that's nearest the horizon there. If you wanted to darken it, you could as well on the back end. We can also add some texture to this. We can select a dark brown, and we can use the sponge to paint over it. You want to use a big sponge in the foreground, and then reduce the size of the sponge as you move towards the background, which will give more of a sense of perspective. And you can of course blend it a little bit if you want to using diffuse blur, kind of horizontal strokes mostly. That gives it some texture and makes it look like dirt and mud. And then as a finishing touch, we'll turn off preserve transparency, we'll select the blur brush, and we'll blur the part of the path that's furthest away. That way it goes off into the distance there. So now let's do something similar to what we just did, and we'll add some mud here to this puddle. So we'll create a layer for mud, and we'll set it to multiply. We'll select that same medium brown color from our dirt, and we'll paint in some mud with the digital airbrush here. So you want it to be pretty thick in the middle, and then it can kind of start to fade out as you get towards the edge here, and that's going to make it look like it's just kind of fading into this grass more naturally. Then we'll turn on preserve transparency, pick a darker brown, and we can use the sponge to put in some texture. We'll go a little bit darker than that so we can see it. Let's turn off preserve transparency, and we'll create a new layer for puddle, and we'll use the digital airbrush to put some water over this mud here. So the water is going to be reflecting the sky color, so you'll want to try to mirror the sky. This reflection is going to be right around here, so we'll just sample this gray color. We'll just put that on first. So we want our edge to be pretty sharp for our water, but we want to not cover up all of the mud. We just want to cover a little bit so it looks like there's a nice edge to it here. Turn on preserve transparency. We can start sampling some other colors and throwing them in. Really all you need is just to kind of imply the colors that are in the sky. You don't have to get it exact. Something like that looks good to me. Now we'll select a dark brown color that's similar to our path, and let's paint along the edge with a dark brown. That will give the water a sense of reflecting the dirt that's around it as well. Let's hide our sketch just so we can see what we're doing better here. And I'm going to zoom into this puddle area so that we can see it a little better as well. Now we want to add a new layer, turn off preserve transparency, and we will make this a screen composite method. We'll call this waterline, and we'll pick a light blue-gray color like this. We'll use the loaded palette knife, and we will put in just a little bit of division here between the water and that dark. This will really help to communicate that this is a pool of water. Just a little bit here and there. And if you wanted to, you could put a couple little ripples. We won't do too many now because we'll do those towards the end, but something like that kind of helps it look like water. Now let's add the trees that are in the midground. So we'll create a new layer. We'll call these trees mid. And we will use a color that's similar to these trees in the background, but we'll just make it a little bit darker in value and maybe a little bit more towards green slightly. We'll use the same square chalk brush, and we will deselect our active selection, which is hiding here from the grass, so that we can paint above it. So we'll do Control D, and now we can paint. So you want the top edge to look like a few individual trees. You don't want it to go too far below the horizon line. So what you can do is you can overpaint it a little bit, and then you can go through with your eraser, and you can just erase the bottom edge here until it just meets right underneath the horizon there. And then we'll blend the bottom of it using the diffuse blur, and we'll just paint vertically with a few light strokes. That'll just kind of set it into the grass there. We can add some highlights to the leaves by turning on preserve transparency and then using the square chalk to put in a lighter green on the edge that's facing towards the light source. You can't really see the light source directly here, and the lightning isn't necessarily going to be the main light source, but we'll just say for composition's sake that most of our light's going to be coming either from the center or mostly from the left, because most of our objects will be over here on the right. Let's add a few trunks using the detail oils, and we'll just sample one of these light brown gray sky colors. You want to use a pretty fine tip detail oils brush because you want these trunks to appear thin and distant. Something like that will suffice. And now we can start working on the grass so that it doesn't look so strange. Let's add a layer above the horizon, and we'll call it grass far. This is going to be some distant grass that we'll draw in. You want to choose the linear size P color brush. That'll make sure that you'll be painting with some of your secondary color. And when you're using this primary and secondary color, you always have to watch which one is selected, otherwise you might have some trouble painting. So we want to click on our secondary color to activate it, and then we want to sample the base color from our grass. Then we just want to lighten it or darken it depending on what we want to paint. So let's lighten it a little bit first. The brush we want to use is Grass Dry, and it looks like this. And you add the tint to it. So we're going to want to do some smaller grass. Let's do a selection off of the horizon. So we'll go to the horizon layer, we'll do select layer content, we'll hide the selection, we'll go to the grass far layer, and we can start painting some distant grass in here. I'm gonna lighten it just a little bit more. You want to go across horizontally, and you want to do it in layers. And as you move into the foreground, you want your grass to get bigger and bigger. So you want to increase your brush size. I'm going to use the right bracket key, hit it 2 or 3 times, That increases my brush scale and the size of the grass. And we're only going to go down to about midway here. So we'll go down to about the top side of this path here. We'll keep our background grass separate from our foreground grass. And we can add some darker grass. You don't want to go too dark and too light because you don't want it to really stand out too much. This just gives it some variance here. Now let's add some grass in front of the path. So we'll click on the path layer. We'll create a new layer. We'll call it grass mid. And we will use the same brush as before. And we will make it quite a bit bigger. So I'm going to hit the right bracket key about 4 or 5 times. And we'll start painting. I'm going to switch back to the lighter color that I was using before. And I'm going to paint in some grass that overlaps the path. You want to be careful just to keep it right here along the edge. Don't overlap it too much. You kind of want these grass blades to connect with the blades that you implied by using that blender there. So I'm just kind of scrubbing back and forth. And again, I'm working kind of horizontally across here. Then I'm going to make my brush bigger using the right bracket key again. Add some grass to the foreground. I want to pay attention to where I'm at when I get next to the mud here. And I'm going to make my brush even bigger again. And fill in the foreground. So you'll notice the mud overlaps the grass a little bit. We can fix that. We can move the grass mid above the water line layer, and now it overlaps as it should. If you painted in too much grass here, you can always go through with your eraser and erase some of it, because we just want it to kind of come up to the mud but not really go into it yet. Now we'll of course want to add some darker grass as we did in the foreground. Continue using this color here, just make it a little bit darker. Add the big grass in the foreground. Make my brush smaller. You don't have to worry about remembering the exact sizes that you use, just as long as you get something close to it. That should be fine. Use the left bracket key to make my brush smaller again. Now let's add another layer underneath the grass mid. Let's call it grass alt. And this will be some dead grass that'll just kind of be behind everything. Let's try this tan color here. Let's put in some of that and see how it looks. You can see since it's behind the grass mid layer, you just see it kind of peeking out here and there. So it doesn't have to be all that noticeable. I'll add a couple dark ones too. Will kind of stand out. So now let's add some shading to this grass, because although each of these blades are individual objects, as a whole they make up a plane, which we'll want to shade as a plane and make it darker in the foreground. So above the grass mid layer, we'll create a new layer. We'll call it grass shadow. We'll make it a multiply composite method, and we'll use a digital airbrush along with a dark blue-green color. We want to switch to our primary color here and then pick the color. Let's try something like this. This will just darken the grass a little bit and make it look a little more natural. We don't want it to really cover up our puddle too much, so what we're going to do is we're going to switch to white, and we're just going to paint over that puddle area with white, and that will just conceal that from the puddle area, but still keep it on the grass. Now let's add a layer underneath that, shadow for grass details, and this will be grass that we will draw by hand. So we'll want to pick a light grass color here. We'll zoom in, especially over by this puddle, because right now it looks really unnatural just having all these grass blades that are going the same direction. So use kind of tapered strokes to draw in some grass blades that are kind of doing their own thing here. Some of them can come up to the water, some of them can be in the water a little bit. You want it to look like this was a recessed area and then the rain filled it up with water. So there might be a couple grass blades that grew since the last storm and they didn't know any better, and now they're getting flooded out here. And basically what this is doing is just cleaning up the edge and making it look more organic. You can also use some darker blades if you want. They don't all have to be the same color. You could use some dry ones. Variety is really what's going to make your piece look realistic. You could even do some over in the background too if you wanted to do a few kind of up on the path or growing in the middle of it. And then for the grass that's in the water or near the water, we'll have to put some reflection. So we'll just sample this dark gray color and then just try to mirror what you have here. So I'm going to kind of paint in the opposite direction, like so. Now it has a little bit of a reflection there that helps it look a little more realistic. So I think that looks good for the grass. We can go ahead and move on to the fun part, which is the lightning. But before we get into that, let's clean house a little bit. Let's group all of our grass layers for the foreground grass. Let's call this grass front. Let's group our puddle layers. We'll call it puddle. And let's group our sky layers and we'll call it sky. That just makes things a little more organized.